Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift into a peaceful slumber together. This time I will tell you about Snow White. Let's get started. Once upon a time, in a vast and prosperous kingdom, there stood a grand castle, surrounded by rolling hills, thick forests, and pristine rivers. Within this magnificent castle lived a gentle and kind-hearted queen who was beloved by all. Though she had everything she could wish for, luxurious garments, a loving husband, and a kingdom full of adoring subjects, there was one thing her heart longed for above all else, a child of her own. One winter's day, as the first snowfall of the season gently blanketed the kingdom in pure white, the queen sat by her window, diligently sewing a delicate embroidery. The window frame was made of rich black ebony, its deep hue a striking contrast to the frosted landscape outside. As the queen continued her needlework, she pricked her finger, and a single drop of blood fell onto the fresh snow that had settled on the windowsill. She gazed at the red droplets against the white snow and the dark frame of the window and sighed wistfully. "Oh, how I wish for a child with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony," she whispered softly to herself, her voice filled with longing. The heavens must have heard her plea, for not long after, the queen found herself with child. The kingdom rejoiced at the news, and the months that followed were filled with anticipation and joy. The queen's health was well taken care of, and the people of the land eagerly awaited the birth of the royal baby. When the time finally came, on a crisp winter morning, a beautiful baby girl was born. Just as the queen had wished, the child had skin as fair as the winter snow, lips as red as the berries that grew in the palace gardens, and hair as dark as the ebony wood that framed the queen's window. The king and queen were overjoyed, and they named their daughter Snow White, in honor of the vision the queen had that fateful day. For a time, happiness filled the castle. The young princess was adored by all, and the queen cherished her with all her heart. Snow White's laughter echoed through the halls, bringing light and warmth even on the coldest of days. She was a child full of wonder, her eyes wide with curiosity at the world around her. Servants and nobles alike doted on her, enchanted by her beauty and charm. But fate can be cruel, and the happiness of the royal family was not destined to last forever. Not long after Snow White's birth, the queen fell gravely ill. Despite the best efforts of the kingdom's healers, her condition worsened with each passing day. The king stayed by her side, refusing to leave her, his heart heavy with sorrow. The people of the kingdom prayed for their beloved queen, hoping that she would recover, but their prayers went unanswered. On a sorrowful winter evening, the queen, weak and pale, held her infant daughter close for the last time. She gazed at the child with love and whispered, "My sweet Snow White, you are my greatest joy. Be kind, be brave, and let your heart shine as brightly as the pure snow." With those final words, she closed her eyes, and the kingdom mourned the loss of their beloved queen. The king was devastated by his wife's passing. Though he ruled wisely and justly, his heart carried a deep sorrow that never truly faded. Snow White, though too young to understand the loss of her mother, grew up with the love and care of the palace servants and her father. Despite his grief, the king made sure that Snow White was raised in an environment of warmth and affection. He would often sit by her cradle, singing lullabies that the queen had once sung, his voice full of both love and melancholy. As Snow White grew, her beauty blossomed. By the time she reached the tender age of 5, she was already known throughout the kingdom as the fairest child in the land. Her hair cascaded in waves of midnight black, her cheeks glowed with a rosy hue, and her eyes, full of innocence and curiosity, sparkled like the stars above. But it was not merely her outward beauty that endeared her to those around her. It was the kindness in her heart, the gentleness of her spirit, and the way she treated everyone with love and respect. The castle staff adored the young princess. She would often wander through the grand halls, greeting each servant with a smile and a cheerful word. She was particularly fond of the palace gardener, an elderly man named Thomas, who had tended the royal gardens for decades. She would sit beside him as he worked, watching in fascination as he planted flowers and tended to the hedges. "Master Thomas, why do you talk to the flowers?" she once asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. The old gardener chuckled, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Because, my dear princess, flowers are like people. They need care, kindness, and gentle words to grow strong and beautiful." Snow White took his words to heart. She would often be found speaking softly to the blooming roses, singing to the lilies, and watching the butterflies dance in the sunlight. The kindness she showed the plants extended to every living thing, whether it was a wounded bird, a frightened kitten, or a weary traveler who arrived at the castle gates. Snow White's compassion knew no bounds. Her father watched her grow with pride, knowing that her mother's spirit lived on in her. Yet, despite the happiness Snow White brought to those around her, the king could not ignore the emptiness in his own heart. He was a ruler, and a kingdom needed a queen. After many years of loneliness, he made the difficult decision to remarry, believing that both he and Snow White needed a woman's presence in their lives once more. As time passed, Snow White grew into a young maiden of extraordinary beauty. Her radiant smile, kind heart, and graceful presence enchanted everyone she met. She moved through the castle with a quiet elegance, treating every servant and noble with kindness. Her beauty was not just in her fair skin, ruby lips, and raven black hair, but also in the warmth she exuded. But in the castle, there was one person who did not find joy in Snow White's blossoming beauty, her stepmother, the Queen. The Queen was a woman of stunning appearance, with emerald green eyes and jet black hair that fell in cascading waves. She carried herself with grace and commanded attention wherever she went. Yet, behind her alluring facade lay a heart filled with vanity, cruelty, and an insatiable hunger for admiration. In her private chamber, hidden from the world, the Queen possessed a magical mirror, a gift from an ancient sorceress. This mirror was no ordinary looking glass. It was enchanted to reveal the absolute truth, and the Queen consulted it every day without fail. Each morning, she would stand before it, draped in the finest silks, her jeweled crown resting upon her head. She would gaze into its gleaming surface and ask in a smooth yet demanding voice, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would always respond, "You, my Queen, are the fairest of them all." The Queen delighted in this affirmation, reassured that no one in the kingdom could rival her beauty. She spent hours admiring her reflection, adjusting her attire, and ensuring that she remained perfect in every way. But one fateful morning, as she performed her usual ritual, something unexpected happened. She stood before the mirror, her lips curving into a satisfied smile as she spoke her question. But this time, the mirror's response was different. "You, my Queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White is fairer than you." A silence fell over the chamber, heavy and cold. The Queen's breath caught in her throat. Her grip on the mirror's golden frame tightened, her long nails digging into the wood. "What?" she hissed, her voice sharp with disbelief. The mirror did not waver. "Snow White is the fairest in the land," it repeated. The Queen's heart pounded. How could this be? For years, she had been the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. She had taken such care to preserve her youth, to maintain her elegance. And now, a mere girl, a child she had tolerated in her home, was surpassing her? She paced the chamber, her mind racing. At first, she tried to dismiss it. The mirror must be mistaken. But no, her mirror had never spoken a falsehood. If it said Snow White was now the fairest, then it must be true. Jealousy began to take root in her heart, twisting and coiling like a poisonous vine. She had allowed the girl to grow too radiant, too admired. The way the servants spoke of her, the way noblemen glanced in her direction, it was unbearable. The queen realized that if she wished to remain the most beautiful, she would have to act. That day, she observed Snow White more closely than ever before. She watched how the girl moved through the castle gardens, how the sun illuminated her flawless skin, how the servants smiled in her presence. The queen could feel her envy burn hotter with each passing moment. She could not allow this. She would not allow it. Her first thought was to diminish Snow White's beauty through mistreatment. She ordered that the girl be given only the simplest garments, stripped of her elegant gowns. No more silk, no more jewelry, nothing that would enhance her appearance. Snow White, however, did not complain. She wore her plain dresses with the same grace, and her beauty did not fade. Frustrated, the queen forbade her from attending royal feasts and celebrations, keeping her away from the eyes of noble guests. Snow White, though saddened, remained cheerful, spending her days in the castle gardens, tending to the flowers and speaking with the animals. But even isolation could not dull her radiance. Word of her beauty still spread beyond the castle walls. Travelers spoke of the princess with awe. Her name was whispered in admiration in towns and villages alike. And no matter how much the queen tried to suppress her, the truth remained: Snow White was the fairest in the land. One evening, as the queen stood before her mirror, she posed her question again, hoping for a different answer. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? Once more, the mirror replied, Snow White is the fairest of them all. The queen's patience shattered. The quiet jealousy that had simmered inside her boiled over into fury. She would not be overshadowed. She would not allow Snow White to exist as a threat to her throne. She clenched her fists, her nails pressing into her palms. There was only one solution. If Snow White lived, the queen would always be second best. If Snow White lived, the mirror would never again tell her that she was the fairest. With cold determination, she devised a plan. She summoned the royal huntsman, a rugged man known for his loyalty to the crown. The queen's voice was calm, yet there was an undeniable steel in her words. Tomorrow at dawn, take Snow White into the forest, she commanded. Tell her it is for a morning stroll. When you are far enough from the castle, kill her. The huntsman's eyes widened. He had served the kingdom for many years, and though he was bound by duty, this order made his stomach churn. Your Majesty, she is but a child, he started. Silence, the queen snapped. You will do as I say. Bring me proof, her heart in this box. She handed him an ornate wooden box, lined with red velvet. The huntsman hesitated, but he knew he could not refuse the queen. Bowing his head, he took the box and left the chamber. The queen watched him go, her heart pounding with dark excitement. By this time tomorrow, Snow White would no longer exist. She turned back to her mirror, exhaling slowly. Soon, she would once again be the fairest of them all. Or so she believed. As dawn broke over the kingdom, a golden hue spread across the castle walls, casting long shadows through the corridors. Snow White, unaware of the dark fate that had been planned for her, awoke with a heart full of innocence and joy. She had always loved the early morning, how the birds sang their first songs and how the cool breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the castle gardens. That morning, a servant knocked on her chamber door, informing her that the queen had arranged a special outing for her. Snow White, always eager for an adventure, clapped her hands with excitement. She had rarely been allowed beyond the castle walls since her stepmother had begun restricting her freedoms, so the thought of a walk in the grand forest thrilled her. Dressing quickly in a simple but lovely gown, she made her way to the castle entrance, where the royal huntsman awaited her. He was a strong man, his face lined with years of hardship, but there was kindness in his eyes. Today, however, his expression was troubled, his movements stiff as he helped her onto a white mare. "We will take the eastern path, princess," he said gruffly, avoiding her gaze. Snow White did not notice his unease, for she was too excited to be outside the castle. As they rode through the gates and into the dense, towering forest, she inhaled deeply, relishing the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds flitted between branches, and the distant murmur of a stream filled the air with a soothing melody. For a time, they traveled in silence. Snow White, lost in the beauty of the forest, did not realize how deep they had ventured. The trees grew thicker, their canopies blocking out the sunlight, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. The further they rode, the quieter the birdsong became, until there was nothing but the sound of the horses' hooves on the soft earth. At last, the huntsman brought the horse to a stop. He dismounted first, then turned to Snow White. "Come down, princess," he said, his voice lower than usual. She slid off the horse gracefully, brushing dust from her skirts. "This is such a beautiful place," she said, smiling up at him. "Are we going to rest here before returning home?" The huntsman looked at her, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists. How could he tell this innocent girl that he had been sent to take her life? How could he betray the light in her eyes? Snow White noticed his troubled expression. "What is wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "Have I done something to upset you?" The huntsman swallowed hard. His heart pounded against his ribs. He could not do this. He could not be the one to take her life. He fell to his knees before her, bowing his head. "Forgive me, princess," he said, his voice hoarse. "I have been sent to kill you." Snow White gasped, stepping back. "What?" "The queen, she ordered your death. She commanded me to bring her your heart as proof." His shoulders shook with shame. "But I cannot do it. You are innocent. You have done nothing to deserve this." Snow White felt her blood run cold. The woman who had raised her, the queen she had tried so hard to please, wanted her dead? It did not seem possible. "No," she whispered. "There must be a mistake." But as she looked into the huntsman's sorrowful eyes, she knew he spoke the truth. "You must run, princess," the huntsman urged, his voice urgent. "Go deep into the forest and never return to the castle. The queen cannot know you live, or she will not stop hunting you." Tears welled in Snow White's eyes, but she did not hesitate. She turned and fled, running as fast as her feet would carry her. The forest, once enchanting, now felt like a nightmare. The trees loomed like dark giants, their branches reaching for her like twisted claws. She stumbled over roots, thorns tore at her dress, and unseen creatures scurried in the underbrush. The deeper she went, the more the sunlight faded, leaving only dim patches of light to guide her way. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing near a fallen tree. Her chest heaved as she gasped for breath, her heart pounding wildly. Fear, sorrow, and exhaustion weighed heavily on her. The queen wanted her dead. She was alone, with nowhere to go. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the reality of her situation set in. She had no home, no protection, and no idea where she was. The towering trees surrounded her like prison walls, their shadows stretching long in the fading daylight. But she could not give up. Wiping her tears, she slowly got to her feet. She had to keep moving. The huntsman had spared her life, but if she remained in one place, she would surely perish either by the queen's hand or the dangers of the wild. Summoning what little strength she had left, she ventured further into the unknown, hoping, praying, that she would find safety before nightfall. Snow White wandered deeper into the forest, her heart still racing from the fear of what had just transpired. The towering trees loomed over her like silent watchers, their dense canopy blocking much of the sunlight. Shadows danced across the forest floor, and the eerie sounds of the wilderness filled her ears, rustling leaves, distant hoots of owls, and the occasional snap of twigs under unseen creatures' feet. She had never been this far from the castle before. Each step she took was cautious, her bare feet, her shoes had been lost in her desperate flight, feeling the cool earth beneath them. Her once pristine dress was torn and muddied, the delicate fabric snagged by the brambles that lined her path. Though the fear of being hunted still gripped her, exhaustion was beginning to take over. Her legs ached, and her throat burned with thirst. She had not eaten since morning, and the hunger gnawed at her stomach. She paused near a small brook, kneeling to cup the clear water in her hands and drink. The cool liquid soothed her dry throat, giving her a moment of relief. As she gazed at her reflection in the water, she barely recognized herself. Her cheeks were flushed from running, her dark hair was tangled, and her usually bright eyes were dulled by exhaustion and sorrow. Would she ever see the castle again? Would she ever feel safe? Snow White shook her head. No, she could not let despair take hold. The huntsman had spared her life, giving her a chance to escape. She had to survive. Summoning her remaining strength, she continued walking. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, and she knew she had to find shelter before nightfall. The forest was already unsettling during the day. She dared not imagine what dangers lurked when darkness fully set in. For what felt like hours, she trudged through the trees, her limbs growing heavier with each step. She was on the verge of collapsing when, through the gaps in the trees, she spotted something unusual, a small cottage nestled among the thick foliage. Her heart leaped with hope. A home! With renewed energy, she hurried toward it. The cottage was unlike anything she had seen before. It was small but charming, with a thatched roof, wooden shutters, and a stone chimney. Vines crept along its walls, and a small wooden fence enclosed a garden filled with wildflowers. A narrow path of stepping stones led up to the round wooden door. Snow White hesitated. She had no idea who lived here. Would they turn her away? Would they be kind? She had no choice but to find out. She knocked gently, but there was no answer. Pressing her ear to the door, she heard nothing inside, no voices, no movement. The house seemed empty. Carefully, she pushed the door open, peeking inside. The interior was unlike anything she had expected. Everything was small, smaller than normal. The furniture, the chairs, the tables, even the beds lined up against the far wall were built for someone much shorter than an average adult. The house was tidy but covered in a thin layer of dust, as though no one had been there for days. Snow White stepped inside, her tired body relieved to finally be out of the open. The warm scent of wood and dried herbs filled the air, comforting in its simplicity. She explored the tiny home, marveling at how everything was made to fit small hands. There were 7 chairs at the dining table, 7 plates stacked neatly on a shelf, and 7 cups waiting to be used. "Who could live here?" she murmured. Her stomach rumbled, drawing her attention to the kitchen area. There, she found a small loaf of bread and a pitcher of fresh milk. Guilt pricked at her conscience. This was someone else's home. But she was so hungry, so weak. "I will make it up to them," she promised herself. "I will clean the house and prepare food for them in return." She took only a small portion of bread and a sip of milk, just enough to quiet her hunger. Then, gathering her strength, she set about tidying the cottage. She swept the floors, dusted the furniture, and washed the dishes. The work gave her a sense of purpose, distracting her from her fear and loneliness. Once everything was clean, exhaustion overtook her. She yawned, her body pleading for rest. Looking at the 7 small beds, she smiled faintly. They were much too tiny for her to sleep comfortably, so she arranged a few of them together, making a space big enough to lie down. As soon as her head touched the soft pillow, she sighed in relief. For the first time since fleeing the castle, she felt safe. With the gentle sounds of the forest outside and the warmth of the cottage around her, Snow White closed her eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She did not know that by nightfall, the owners of the cottage, the 7 dwarfs, would return and find their home very different from how they had left it. The forest was quiet as dusk settled in, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves in the wind. A narrow, winding path led from the mountains to the small cottage where Snow White now slept. Along this path, 7 small figures were making their way home after a long day of work in the mines. They were the 7 dwarfs, miners by trade, who spent their days deep within the mountains, digging for precious gems and metals. Each carried a small pickaxe over his shoulder, and their faces, though weary from labor, were filled with contentment. They enjoyed their work, and though their home was deep in the woods, they lived happily together. As they neared the cottage, the dwarf leading the group, Doc, the eldest and wisest, held up a hand to signal the others to stop. "Something isn't right," he murmured. The others peered ahead. The windows of their cottage were glowing with warm light. "That's strange," muttered Grumpy, crossing his arms. "We left this morning and put out the lanterns. Who's been in our house?" "Maybe it's a ghost," whispered Bashful, shrinking behind the others. "Nonsense," Doc said, though his own voice was uncertain. "Let's be careful. We don't know what or who is inside." With silent steps, the 7 dwarfs crept toward the cottage. Dopey, the most curious of them all, pressed his ear against the door. He heard nothing but the soft crackling of the fireplace. Doc slowly pushed the door open, and they all peeked inside. Their eyes widened. The house had been cleaned. The dusty shelves now gleamed, the wooden floor shone, and the dishes had been neatly stacked. The table was set as if someone had been here, and there was even a lingering scent of fresh bread in the air. "Someone's been in our house," muttered Grumpy, his brows furrowed. "They cleaned it," said Happy, beaming. "Maybe we should invite them to stay." "We don't even know who they are," Doc reminded him, stepping cautiously inside. The others followed, their small boots making soft thuds against the polished wood. Then, as they moved further in, they noticed something even stranger. "Look," cried Sneezy, pointing to the beds. "Someone's sleeping there." The dwarfs rushed forward. There, sprawled across their beds, lay a young woman. Her dark hair fanned across the pillows, her cheeks were flushed with sleep, and her breathing was deep and steady. "She's beautiful," murmured Bashful, his face turning pink. "But who is she?" asked Sleepy, rubbing his eyes. Grumpy huffed. "We should wake her up. Who just walks into someone else's house and takes a nap?" Doc, Eva the leader, nodded. "Carefully, now. Let's not startle her." He stepped forward and gently shook Snow White's shoulder. Miss, wake up." Snow White stirred, her lashes fluttering. Slowly, she opened her eyes, blinking in confusion as she saw 7 small faces staring at her. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Then, realization dawned, and she sat up quickly. Oh, my goodness." She looked around, remembering where she was. The dwarfs took a step back as she clutched the blanket to her chest, eyes wide. Who are you?" Doc cleared his throat. "We might ask the same of you, miss. This is our house." Snow White gasped, embarrassment flooding her face. "Oh, I am so sorry. I had nowhere else to go." The dwarfs exchanged glances. Doc gave her a kind smile. "It's all right, dear. Why don't you tell us who you are?" Taking a deep breath, Snow White began her tale. She told them of the jealous queen, the huntsman's mercy, and her desperate escape through the forest. As she spoke, the dwarfs listened intently, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. When she finished, there was a long silence. "That's terrible," Happy said at last. "She wants you dead?" Bashful whispered, horrified. "She won't stop looking for you," Doc said grimly. "If you stay here, it might be dangerous." Snow White's heart sank. "I understand. I will leave if I must." But before she could rise, Happy piped up, "Wait. She could stay. She cleaned the house so nicely, and she could keep it that way while we're at work." "Yes, and she can cook," Sneezy added with enthusiasm. "It would be nice to come home to a warm meal." "She doesn't have anywhere else to go," Sleepy pointed out. Grumpy crossed his arms. "I don't know. It's a risk." But when Snow White's pleading eyes met his, he sighed in defeat. "Fine. But if she's staying, she has to be careful. The queen will come looking for her sooner or later." The others cheered. Snow White smiled in relief. "Thank you. I promise to be of help to you all." And so, it was settled. Snow White would stay in the cottage with the 7 dwarfs, safe for now, unaware that the queen would soon learn of her survival. Back in the grand castle, the evil queen stood before her enchanted mirror, draped in her most elegant robes. She had spent the day in satisfaction, believing that Snow White was dead, that her beauty would no longer threaten her reign. With a smirk, she gazed at her reflection and spoke the words she had uttered countless times before. "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" She waited, expecting the answer that had once soothed her pride. But the mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and a cold voice echoed through the chamber. "You, my queen, are fair, 'tis true. But Snow White still lives, fairer than you." The queen's breath caught. "What?" she hissed. "Impossible." The huntsman took her into the forest. He was to bring me her heart. The mirror's glass shimmered again, revealing an image, a small cottage deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees. Inside, Snow White was laughing with 7 small men, her face glowing with happiness. The queen's hands clenched into fists. She had been deceived. The fool spared her, she growled. He betrayed me. Her fury was unlike anything she had ever felt. Snow White, the one she had ordered to be destroyed, was alive, thriving, hidden away in a place the queen had never known existed. I must deal with this myself, she murmured, pacing the cold stone floor. No one else can be trusted. Her eyes darkened as a sinister idea formed. If Snow White had found safety, she would lure her out of it. And what better way than through deception? Turning swiftly, she strode to her private chamber, a place even her most loyal servants feared to enter. The room was dimly lit, lined with ancient tomes and glass jars filled with strange, writhing substances. A cauldron stood in the center, its surface coated in a layer of dust. The queen stretched out her hands, whispering words of power. The air grew thick with energy as the cauldron bubbled to life, glowing an eerie green. She pulled ingredients from the shelves, withered roots, the feather of a raven, the venom of a viper. Each item fell into the potion with a hiss. But she needed something more, something deadly. Reaching for a small, blackened box, she opened it to reveal a single, shriveled heart. It had belonged to a woman who had perished from sorrow long ago, her pain and despair forever trapped in its lifeless flesh. With a wicked smile, the queen dropped the heart into the brew. The liquid churned violently, then settled into a sickly golden hue. She plucked a flawless red apple from a nearby bowl and dipped it into the potion. The moment it touched the liquid, the apple absorbed its essence, turning a deep, unnatural crimson. When she lifted it from the cauldron, the fruit gleamed, its surface smooth and inviting. "One bite," the queen whispered, turning the apple in her hands. "One bite, and she will sleep in death forever." A cruel smile stretched across her lips. But before she could deliver her poison gift, she needed a disguise. She turned to a small silver box on her shelf, flicking it open to reveal fine white powder. The powder, when consumed, would alter her appearance for a time. Scooping a small amount onto her fingertip, she placed it on her tongue. The taste was bitter, like burnt herbs and old bones. At first, nothing happened, then pain racked her body. She fell to her knees as her bones twisted, her skin sagging, her elegant hands shriveling into gnawed claws. Her long, dark hair thinned and turned a wispy white, and her regal gown faded into tattered, ragged robes. Her smooth voice cracked into a rasp. She was no longer a queen. She was an old hag. She hobbled to the mirror and grinned at her reflection. Sunken eyes, warty skin, a hunched posture, perfect. No one would recognize her now. Cackling softly, she grasped the poison apple and tucked it into a basket filled with harmless fruit. "Soon, my dear Snow White," she crooned, "your beauty will fade forever." And with that, she left the castle, vanishing into the depths of the forest, hunting for the girl who had unknowingly become her greatest enemy. The days Snow White spent in the cottage were some of the happiest she had ever known. Each morning, she helped the dwarfs prepare for their long day at the mines, sending them off with warm meals and cheerful farewells. Then, she would tidy the house, tend to the small garden, and hum as she worked, enjoying the peaceful rhythm of her new life. She had grown especially fond of the 7 dwarfs, each with their own quirks. Doc, the leader, always offered wise advice. Grumpy, despite his constant frown, had a soft heart deep down. Happy's laugh filled the cottage with warmth, while Bashful turned red at the smallest compliment. Sleepy dozed off at the most unexpected times, Sneezy had a habit of sending things flying with his powerful sneezes, and Dopey, though he never spoke, was full of joyful mischief. Snow White often thought about the danger that lurked beyond the forest, but she trusted the dwarf's warnings to stay hidden. But evil never sleeps. The queen, disguised as an old peddler woman, had spent days searching for the cottage, her cunning eyes scanning the forest for any sign of life. When she finally spotted the small house nestled among the trees, a wicked grin spread across her wrinkled lips. "She is here," she whispered to herself, clutching the poison apple in her bony hand. She watched from a distance, waiting until the dwarfs left for the mines. One by one, they walked down the path, their cheerful voices fading into the trees. Now was her chance. Snow White was inside, kneeling by the window as she arranged a bouquet of fresh-picked flowers in a small vase. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass, making her dark hair shine like silk. She was humming softly, completely unaware of the danger drawing closer. A sudden knock at the door made her pause. She frowned. The dwarfs had told her never to open the door for strangers. But what if someone needed help? What if it was a lost traveler? Setting the flowers aside, she moved to the door but kept it closed. "Who is it?" she called. Outside, the queen licked her cracked lips before answering in a frail, wavering voice. "Good day, dearie," she croaked. "I am just a poor old woman selling apples. The finest apples in the land." Snow White hesitated. "I'm sorry, but I cannot open the door." The queen's smile twitched, but she quickly masked her frustration. "Oh, but my dear, you must at least see them. Such beauty, such sweetness. A young girl like you deserves only the finest fruit." Snow White bit her lip. The voice sounded harmless, kind, even. She peered through the small window beside the door and saw an old woman in tattered robes, leaning on a wooden cane. Her face was wrinkled, her eyes sunken, but her smile seemed warm. Snow White's heart softened. "Perhaps, just a peek," she murmured, unlatching the window instead of the door. The queen grinned beneath her hood. She reached into her basket and pulled out the most stunning apple, large, glossy, and red as fresh blood. "See how lovely it is," she cooed, holding it up for Snow White to admire. Snow White's eyes widened. "It does look delicious." "Ah, but you must taste it, child," the queen urged, her voice dripping with faint sweetness. "I would not sell anything I have not tasted myself." To prove her point, she lifted a second apple and took a small, careful bite. She chewed, swallowed, then smiled. "See? Perfectly safe." Snow White giggled. "It must be wonderful to travel and sell such fine fruit." "Oh, it is, my dear," the queen lied smoothly. "And you, so beautiful, so kind, you remind me of my own granddaughter. Take this apple as a gift." Snow White hesitated, but only for a moment. It was just an apple, after all. The woman had eaten one herself, hadn't she? She reached through the window and accepted the fruit. The queen held her breath as Snow White turned the apple in her hands, admiring its perfect shine. Slowly, she lifted it to her lips and took a bite. The moment her teeth broke the skin, a strange dizziness washed over her. Her vision blurred, her head swam, and she felt as though the ground had been pulled from beneath her. The apple slipped from her fingers, rolling onto the floor as she stumbled backward, gasping for air. Her limbs grew heavy. Her heart pounded. Then, darkness. Snow White collapsed to the ground, her long lashes fluttering before closing completely. Her chest rose and fell in slow, shallow breaths. She was still, pale as fresh snow. The queen watched in satisfaction as the curse took hold. "Sleep well, my little princess," she whispered, her voice dripping with triumph. "For this sleep has no waking." With one last glance at the girl lying motionless on the floor, the queen turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving only silence behind. The cottage stood silent, the warmth and laughter of the morning now replaced with an eerie stillness. Snow White lay on the wooden floor, her face as peaceful as if she were simply sleeping. The half-bitten apple rested beside her, its red skin gleaming ominously in the dim light. Hours passed. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sound of boots crunching over leaves broke the quiet. The 7 dwarfs were returning home, their voices full of cheer after a long day in the mines. But as they neared the cottage, something felt wrong. "There's no light in the window," Doc observed, his brows furrowing. "She always lights the lantern before we come home," Happy added, his usual smile fading. A cold dread settled in their chests as they hurried to the door. The moment they stepped inside, their eyes landed on the motionless figure on the floor. A collective gasp filled the room. "Snow White!" Bashful cried, rushing forward. Dopey tugged at her arm, trying to wake her, while Sneezy sniffled, his tears threatening to trigger a powerful sneeze. Grumpy knelt beside her, his hand shaking. "Wake up," he grumbled, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Come on, this isn't funny." But Snow White did not stir. "She's so pale," Sleepy murmured, rubbing his eyes, as if hoping he was dreaming. Doc carefully placed his ear to her chest, listening for a heartbeat. Relief washed over him when he found one, weak, but still there. "She's alive," he breathed. The others exhaled in unison, but their relief was short-lived. "If she's alive, why won't she wake up?" Happy asked desperately. Doc's gaze fell upon the apple beside her. His eyes narrowed. "Poison." Grumpy's fists clenched. "That witch. The queen did this." "She must have tricked her," Bashful whispered, wiping at his eyes. Sneezy let out a trembling sigh. "What do we do?" No one had an answer. They carried Snow White to a bed, tucking her in gently. Days passed, then weeks, but she remained trapped in her cursed slumber. The dwarfs refused to bury her, unwilling to accept that she was truly gone. Instead, they built a beautiful glass coffin and placed her inside, setting it atop a small hill near the cottage. Every day, they visited, bringing fresh flowers, speaking to her as if she could hear them. Seasons changed, yet Snow White remained unchanged, her skin still fair, her lips still red, as if time itself refused to touch her. Until one fateful day, a young prince, who had heard whispers of a maiden more beautiful than any in the land, had been traveling through the forest. When he spotted the dwarfs tending to the glass coffin, curiosity pulled him closer. "What is this?" he asked gently. Doc looked up, his expression sorrowful. "A terrible tragedy. This is Snow White." The prince's eyes widened. He had heard of her, a princess, lost to the world. But he had never imagined such beauty, even in slumber. "She looks as though she could wake at any moment," he whispered, unable to take his eyes off her. Grumpy scoffed. "If only that were true." The prince's heart ached. He did not know this girl, yet something about her called to him, something deep, something unexplainable. Without thinking, he knelt beside the coffin and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a shuddering breath escaped Snow White's lips. Her fingers twitched. Her lashes fluttered. And then her eyes opened. The dwarfs gasped. The prince stumbled back in shock. Snow White blinked, dazed, before sitting up slowly. Where? Her voice was soft, uncertain. The dwarfs swarmed her, their joyful cries filling the air. You're awake. Snow White, you're awake. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she embraced them, her heart overwhelmed. Oh, my dear friends, what happened? They told her everything, the queen's deception, the poison apple, how they had kept watch over her all this time. And lastly, they gestured to the prince, who still stood in stunned silence. It was him, Doc said. He woke you. Snow White turned to the prince, her cheeks flushing. You did? He nodded, a warm smile growing on his face. I don't know why, but I felt like I had to. Like I was meant to. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something blossomed between them, something unspoken, yet undeniable. Far away, in the queen's castle, the magic mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The evil queen's spell was broken. Her reign of terror was over. Snow White returned to the palace with the prince, where she was reunited with those who had once believed her lost. The kingdom, upon learning of the queen's wickedness, cast her out forever. And so, Snow White's story did not end in sorrow, but in joy. With the dwarfs always welcome in her home, and the prince by her side, she lived happily ever after. That's the story of Snow White. Hopefully this story can help you sleep. Good night.